Hello, I'm Nina Melendez. Welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're talking about pay transparency. It's been credited with closing unfair pay gaps and can help workers negotiate higher salaries. But the practice of sharing compensation information can have negative effects as well. So should we be talking about our salaries with our coworkers? Joining me now is Zoe Cullen. She's an assistant professor of economics at Harvard Business School. Her research is focused on labor markets and the decisions employers make on things like pay transparency, pay inequality, and criminal background screening. She graduated with a PhD from Stanford in economics and got her undergraduate from Yale. Zoe, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Nina.
So great to have you, Zoe. Just for some background, where did this idea of pay transparency come from?
Oh, wow. I think you might be asking some historical context that's outside of my expertise. But I think the colloquial use of the term pay transparency has often been in the context of the workplace. And certainly we've had laws dating back to the NLRB in 1930s, which really did include some protections for workers to communicate about wages in order for primarily the intent of organizing.
So when we talk about pay transparency, how transparent are we talking? Like what exactly is the transparency that we're discussing?
That is an interesting question, because I think there's a wide range. And I've gotten into the habit of thinking about partial transparency. So something in between, say, full secrecy where you know nothing about what your coworkers are earning, to the extreme full transparency, which might even include information about who you are and exactly what you're paid posted on some public website. I think typically we think of most workplaces as something in between. So there might be gossip. That gossip may be accurate to some extent. So in research, in at least one context, so a large bank, it looked like workers on average, if they had to guess the average of what their coworkers are paying, their best guess would just be to regurgitate what they themselves were earning. So very little information above and beyond what they see in their own paycheck.
So Zoe, when me and my coworkers were talking about this topic, we all sort of agreed that like we're not actually supposed to talk about our pay, our wage, our salaries. And I remember coming into the workforce just in general as a professional and knowing that that was sort of a taboo subject, right? You don't discuss this with other people. And then we were all going, where did we learn this from? Like, where did we get that directive? Like, and I'm just curious if you have that answer, if you know, like, where does this idea come from that we're not supposed to talk about our salaries with each other?
I think it comes from many places at this point in time. So, the question of where the roots originally arrived from is less clear, but certainly some employers have official policies on the books that state you should not disclose your salary, especially when it comes to disclosing to outsiders, so people who you don't immediately work with. And typically those are called gag laws because they're not legally enforceable. But at this point in time, I think some of the taboo is clearly stemming from interpersonal relationships. So perhaps the fear of resentment for if you announce to a coworker that you're earning something and it turns out to be more than they make. And we do see some evidence of that in just people's willingness to ask about others and also reveal, even when the employer's disclosure policy is lifted.
I do want to talk about that resentment issue because it came up a lot in the comments when I posted this show on the feed. Before I get to that, I just want to pause and say hi to some of the members who are joining us from around the country. We have Dolores from Texas, Anne from Hong Kong, Melvin from Chicago, and Anne from Toronto. And for everyone who's just joining, I'm speaking with Zoe Cullen. She's an assistant professor at Harvard Business School, and she is the expert on all things about pay transparency and the decisions that employers have to make on these things. And would love to hear from you. Put it in the stream. Do you think that you should be able to share your salaries with your coworkers? Should this be sort of an open forum, or is such a thing private? We'd love to get your thoughts. Zoe, I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned in your previous answer about employers not being able to reinforce gag laws. So I did not know that before the show. Can you sort of dispel the myth that we are not allowed at work to talk about our salaries?
Sure. So, I'm talking about the U.S. context, to be clear. And as I mentioned, as far back as 1935, there have been protections for workers who would like to discuss salaries, and they're enforced by the National Labor Relations Act. And so in that context, they are typically, the argument is that without the ability of workers to talk to each other about wages, the act of unionizing would be a challenge. And so this would be prohibitive to organizing steps. So for that reason, there is a blanket policy that prevents employers in the US from prohibiting workers from talking to each other about their pay. Now, you might say this is a toothless tiger, it has been said, in part because that particular set of laws did not put in place punishments for employers that have punished employees for breaking this rule. So in fact, if an employer were to quote unquote retaliate by firing you for discussing your pay, you could take legal action, but there wouldn't be the kind of punitive damages for an employer that necessarily are strong enough to prevent an employer from simply going ahead and finding a way to dismiss you. So I think there have been a number of states since then that have passed laws that are much stronger in spirit. So they will have penalties for employers for going ahead and retaliating against employees for discussing pay with one another. And so, at this time, actually, I think we can talk about the individual states that have passed them, but in fact, even in recent years, in 2018, 19, and 20, you've seen many more states take action, and there's a federal law that protects all workers for companies that have had a federal contract or have an active federal contract.
So you can discuss it among your coworkers, but if there's a policy against it, then the employer can't really be punished for it. I love that toothless tiger analogy. Has the argument for pay transparency is that it helps close the gender pay gap or the racial pay gap. In your research, have you found that to be true?
Broadly speaking, I think it's important to think about the short-term effects and the longer-term effects, and I do think that consistently, when we think about suddenly disclosing pay moving from a relatively pay secret world to a much more transparent world, we do see the first set of effects as follows. So somebody who discovers they're a lesser paid worker relative to coworkers uses that information to renegotiate pay. So, and this would typically be people, or in many workplaces on the lower end of the spectrum, you might see more minorities, more women. And so in the sense that you just asked, this would lead to a closing of the pay gap.
So that's interesting. And also the idea of going to your boss and saying, hey, Joe, my coworker makes X amount. I want to make the same. What about taking into account Joe's background and Joe's work history? How does that factor into the discrepancy in the pay gap?
So I think it's sort of sometimes helpful to take a theoretical perspective on this. So let me just talk about what you might expect to happen in theory, and then we can talk about the empirics. Mm-hmm. In theory, when we learn about what our coworkers making, we learn something about what our employer is willing to pay us. So that's sort of insider information you might have about the negotiation position that you're in, which can help you. And suppose your colleague is more productive than you, but you understand just how much more productive he is or she is. And so as a consequence, learning your coworkers' pay still gives you some information about what your worth is. So, if you think you're doing identical work, it's much clearer that, your employer is willing to pay for, this much for this set of tasks. If there are differences in experience and productivity, of course, there's more discretion but you might still learn something about your employer's willingness to pay with that information. So I think some of these differences workers can take into account when they're trying to understand how to make use of that information.
Are employees pretty good at guessing what their coworkers make?
No. No, they're not. So
if I were to guess what my coworker Bob makes, I would probably be completely off then.
So I think the right way to think about this is that your guess, on the average employee's guess, is no better than if they just reported what their own salary is. So that's sort of suggestive that there's not additional information that they're using. And that's on average. But the distribution of guesses is going to look very much like the distribution of incomes in a given position.
And are employees aware when there are pay inequalities within their own company, generally speaking?
So I only have indirect information about that. So for example, in the workplaces I've studied, women earn less than men, but they're still just as accurate at guessing what the average salary is in the position, meaning that they can infer that there must be a discrepancy between what women are earning and men are earning.
I want to bring up, actually, Zoe, a comment from one of our members. His name is Diego. And this was in regards to, in response to the post that we put up for the show. Diego says, knowing someone else's pay without knowing someone else's worth is usually less than half of the picture. Pay alone is not actionable information, so one should be very careful when drawing objective comparisons to individual coworkers. It would potentially land you in a world of hurt. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I specifically want to discuss what he says about pay alone isn't actionable information. And we kind of touched upon this in discussing, your work history for your salary. What are your thoughts about what Diego said?
Oh, I think Diego is very insightful with that comment, and it does touch on what I was describing earlier. So, in some sense, if you have good insight into the productivity of your coworkers and what they're contributing to the firm, the information about their earnings is going to be much more informative about one's own ability to negotiate with their employer.
I'm going to say hi to some of the members who are also joining us. We've got this, the stream is on fire, I'm told. So this is a great conversation and everyone's loving it. So thank you, Zoe. I want to say hi to Joe from Georgia, Michael from Oregon, Robert from San Diego, and Rose from New York. Please let us know your thoughts on this show in the stream, and we'll get those asked for you from to Zoe Cullen, who's an assistant professor at Harvard Business School. Zoe, aren't some people just paid more because they're better at the negotiating table? And shouldn't that be taken into account when we talk about pay discrepancies and pay transparency?
Yes, so this actually touches on what the longer term effects might be of pay transparency. In a relatively pay secret world, the employer's incentive is to basically negotiate, but eventually accept an offer from a worker as long as they're more productive than that particular pay offer. So in some sense, the ceiling for a worker's salary in a relatively pay secret world is going to be at least as high as the productivity of the worker. So what they're contributing to the firm. Now, if we move to a pay transparent world, paying one worker a very high salary because they're very productive, or because they've negotiated a very high salary up to where their productivity is equal to, say, their value, their pay is equal to their value. Now that particular negotiation will have spillovers on other workers' negotiations. So to be really clear, if one person is very good at negotiating in a pay secret world, suddenly they may be at a disadvantage in a more pay transparent world because their success at negotiating is going to affect how others negotiate, in that the information becomes widely available and other workers are going to potentially use it. And now the employer is going to be in a much stronger, or they're going to bargain much more aggressively in that kind of instance.
So actually that brings up a member comment. His name is Kevin. Kevin was making a comment about bidding wars. He said, I believe if we started sharing this information, it would start a bidding war for increases, which makes me wonder if, a bidding war would just incentivize employers to just lower the pay scale across the board. And therefore, the result of pay transparency would mean that everyone's salary is just a little bit lower. What are your thoughts?
I think there's a lot about that intuition you just described. So to start with Kevin's point, indeed, if the information became known, especially if it became known and the employers could not anticipate it, yes, you would likely see workers who had been earning less start to inch up towards the people who had been paid more. If now we think about how the employers respond by anticipating that there is a pay transparent world that they're operating in, now indeed the very highest salaries become extremely costly for them because there are all these spillovers to other workers' salaries. And so they theoretically, and what we've shown empirically, is they will lower the ceiling for salaries in a given position.
And your paper specifically focused on the pay transparency between managers and their subordinates. And what is the impact of employees finding out that their bosses make a certain amount more than them?
Okay. So far the conversation has been centered around learning about what your coworkers make.
Yeah.
We've been sort of assuming that they are similar to you, doing similar work to you. Oftentimes, transparency policies end up revealing a whole lot more than that, because imagine posting the average salary in a given position. Now you're going to see your position, but you might also see your manager's position, your manager's manager's position. Now that has a lot of implications for what you might learn about your entire career trajectory. I'm thinking now from the employee's perspective. And so, and we have seen perhaps not so surprisingly, people underestimate significantly what their managers earn. And as a result, this type of information reveals two things, let's say. One is that if they were to be promoted to their manager's position, they would probably be compensated more than they thought previously. And another is that there's a lot more inequality in the workplace than they previously believed between layers of the organization.
So it can perhaps incentivize you and just help you in your career trajectory, because if you know that your boss makes a certain amount more, then you're more inclined to perhaps stay at the company and work and get your boss's job.
Yeah, it was an open question as to whether learning about how much inequality there was would have had the sort of disincentive effects, lower morale, et cetera, that could offset the effects you just described, with the motivating effects of learning you could earn much more. And in the context we studied, which happened to be a large commercial bank, the motivating effects far outweighed what we might think of as the morale disincentive effects from learning about inequality in the workplace.
So talking about morale, I want to bring up a comment that our member Paul wrote. He says, listing a salary range on an ad is acceptable, but internally it gets into individual comparisons within the range. That's where I've seen it cause major dissension on all of the teams I've been a part of, from the viewpoint of both the worker and as a supervisor. So again, from the viewpoint of both the worker and as a supervisor, is that a fair assessment across the board, that when employees find out that there are such certain pay discrepancies among their coworkers, that there is dissension and disharmony and jealousy?
Yes, so let me quote research that's not my own, but by Emily Breza and Supri Kaur, suggesting that when you lift the veil of secrecy, and there are differences between workers' pay, that does typically generate the kinds of effects that Paul describes of dissent and morale loss. Workers seem to be even willing to walk away from jobs as a response. Now, this is what I think of as sort of stage one, because a perceptive manager or a perceptive employer might respond by thinking about what would be the optimal wages in such a setting. So yes, in a setting where the inequality persists and little is done about that, I think Paul's correct that it can create quite a lot of unhappiness.
I also want to bring up a couple of comments that people are writing in this stream right now as we're talking. Marie says, some people are better negotiators, but that doesn't mean they are better at their jobs. We touched upon this in the negotiating. And Dolores says, in my experience, I found that it's an unspoken rule. If you discuss salary with coworkers, it can be grounds for dismissal. And we touched upon this as well, this sort of understanding unspoken rule that it's supposed to be private and secret. And actually, I do want to come back to this, Zoe, and in your research or sort of in any of your findings, have you found out where, why companies aren't more transparent about their salaries?
Well, let me just first respond to this. I think we should all be, if it's an unspoken rule, we should be somewhat suspicious and perhaps and push for more clarity on those unspoken rules. This hard question of why employers might not choose voluntarily to be more transparent might have a lot to do with the issues we've discussed about the transition period. So imagine moving from a relatively pay secret world to a relatively pay transparent world. There are going to be a lot of growing pains, let's call them, because you might be in a situation where prior negotiations under the veil of secrecy have led to the types of inequality that do kind of promote a lot of dissension between employees, hurt cooperation, might damage productivity. But it is a harder question to say, why haven't firms taken a longer view perspective on this, knowing now, at least from research, that there's a motivating effect from informing workers about what the career trajectory might look like at a firm, and there's also a bargaining advantage to firms that are very clear about the going pay, and so some of it might have to do with open questions that even academics face. So it's very easy to imagine managers didn't know the answers. We didn't know the answers either to what that might look like. So some of it, I think, is real-time learning through research. And another issue that firms face are agency issues. So the person who's making these decisions might not be the person who is actually facing the consequences of how employees respond or how productivity or how work happens. So this is this would be agency issues, the way HR work with executives to figure out what the right thing is. Perhaps a manager has their own incentives when deciding to keep things secret that are different from say the firm's incentives.
Zoe, what about some of the companies that have implemented pay transparency? Is there any research on how employees have felt afterwards, or how the company is faring, how managers are doing?
Oh, yes. So this is it's actually quite helpful to think about some examples, because you can also see how just very hard it is to do, in the sense that if you want to commit to transparency as a manager or as an employer, you have to convince your employees that, in fact, you're really truly being transparent, and that is not trivial. So the firms that have done it, I mean, Buffer.com being the most probably extreme out there, they've had to basically post formulas of how the pay is being calculated, and it's a function of where you work, it's a function of your experience and your background and your role, and you can see that that's sort of like a public calculator is sort of what it takes in order to convince employees that indeed, the employer is telling you the truth. And so, the other policies that get at transparency usually rely on coworkers being able to talk to each other, because there's some suspicion that the employer, if they had a choice, would always tell you that they're not paying people as much as they really are. So it is hard to actually commit, and that's where public policy can be so helpful, because policies that come out and mandate firms policies, to transparency policies. So, the case of the states that actually put in really harsh penalties for employers that retaliate, for example, that actually can be helpful for a manager in a firm to basically commit to a policy that in the end can be beneficial.
I'm so curious if after this show, everyone's going to just start saying, hey, this is how much I make a year. And there's going to be widespread openness. I do want to end on this comment from Jenna. She says, pay transparency creates an environment for equality, and that is the most important thing. If someone isn't worth what they make, then that's a leadership issue, not an employee issue. Thank you for that comment, Jenna. And Zoe, I want to thank you again for joining us on the show. Like I said, the stream was loving it, so we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you very much, Nina. It's been a pleasure.
That was Zoe Cullen. She is an assistant professor of economics at Harvard Business School. And you can continue the conversation here on the stream, or if you're interested in some of our other stories, you can check out our news module to the right of your screen, or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. And tomorrow we release episode 4 of our new 6-part series titled Reshuffle, starring Tamron Hall. And this episode looks at one woman who had to readapt her sales traveling position after the pandemic hit. Here's a sneak peek.
When it comes to traditional sales, it's all about creating that face-to-face connection. And for Americans in the sales industry, that often meant travel, a lot of it. The no travel policies of the pandemic required industries to employ new tech solutions. As they head back out on this new hybrid road of in-person and e-sales, how are sales industry professionals reshuffling their workflow and finding new ways to close the deal? I'm Tamron Hall, and this is Reshuffle.
I'm Nina Melendez. Thanks so much for watching LinkedIn News Live.